Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, her novel, The Gilded Butterfly Effect, looks at sorority culture, Greek culture at the University of Michigan. Heather Colley joins me on the program. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to chat a bit about my book.
My pleasure. So I guess maybe we'll start, did you go to the U of Michigan?
Yes, I did. I graduated in 2020, so a few years ago now. And yeah, so I did see firsthand a lot of the things that I wrote about in the book.
Yeah, I was curious about kind of how much verite is in this. As someone who went to university in Canada where there isn't really a Greek culture,
Oh, okay.
It's all foreign to me, but it's like, how true is this? How accurate is this? And was that even a concern of yours writing it? Was like the accuracy or like believability?
Yeah, I definitely was concerned about believability. I didn't want to make it too extreme so as to be absurd, but it also is very much exaggerated from what I did see. I kind of took bits and pieces of Greek life at Michigan and at other schools that I visited around that time, and hyperbolized them a lot. But I also wanted it to be realist, and I wanted people to possibly be able to see how this could really be happening on campuses.
So heightened for dramatic effect, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
So the roots of the story then, like obviously from observation and examination of this culture, it doesn't necessarily. It might give you the milieu in which Penny and Stella exist, but it doesn't give you Penny and Stella. And I'm curious, which of those two characters were kind of like your entryway to this story?
I started with Stella, and originally there weren't going to be two main characters. It wasn't going to be Stella and Penny. I started off with just Stella writing her story, and then I realized that she needed a contrast. She needed someone external from the system, from Greek life, and that's how Penny kind of came about. And I really like the idea of like a foil and things like that, kind of double-sided characters or two characters who are the same side of one coin. So that's how I kind of came up with those two after originally thinking of Stella.
So it was going to be just an insider's kind of perspective on it. At what
Yeah,
point?
and yeah, exactly. And so it started off just sort of brief scenes. Actually, it started off just short stories, really, without much of a focus of Stella or Penny. Just short stories set in this system, the Greek life system. And then Stella and Penny, when I created them and created them in contrast to one another, that's how I started to develop the plot.
So how far, like you'd written several sort of Stella shorts and then realized you needed that like competing voice?
Yeah, I actually, the first thing that I wrote in the book was a story that's from an omniscient perspective that comes kind of in the middle of the book. It's where you first meet Trip in his frat house. And actually, he doesn't even really interact with Stella or Penny. He's just at a party and he meets a girl called Loretta. So that was the first story that I wrote. And then I knew that I wanted to kind of populate this world a little bit more. So I created Stella, who would have some sort of history with Trip. And then I felt that I needed a balance. So I needed somebody like Penny to be the other perspective so that we're not just totally immersed and claustrophobic in this world. We have the kind of everyman, the outsider, the kind of person reading it who might be external and might be looking at all of this with a lot of surprise.
So how do you then develop the voice of each of these characters? Particularly Stella and Penny, and like differentiating kind of tonally or emotionally through what they're writing.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the challenges when it comes to writing dual perspectives is giving them their own voice and making sure that they sound distinct. You want the reader to feel like they're following two different people. At the same time, I wanted them to be mirrors of one another. So they have a lot more in common than I think either of them realize or perhaps would admit. So Penny is much more depressed in general. She has very little hope and optimism compared to Stella. Stella is also dealing with her own mental health issues, but I think she sees a lot more opportunity. She thinks that there's still things that she can do in the system. And so I think she's slightly more optimistic, and that comes out with how she tries to manipulate people for opportunity. And she has a bit more like liveliness, I think, to her character, whereas Penny starts off quite depressed and it gets worse as the story goes on.
Yeah, in my own reading, it's like Stella sees things as challenges and Penny sees things as obstacles.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it. Definitely, like Penny, for example, she struggles with her mental health and she can't get the medication that she needs, whereas Stella is engaging with her psychiatrist and realizes that she can manipulate the psychiatrist to get her what she wants. So I think that that's a really accurate way to describe them. Yeah, they just have different ways of engaging with the world, and that kind of results in how things progress for both of them.
So you alluded to the mental health issues. How important was that? Like, were those something that these two characters were dealing with, like from the jump, in terms of like when you conceived of them?
I think for Penny, especially, that was very central to her character right from the beginning. I knew that I wanted her to be coming from the outside, from a different campus, and she needed a sort of an impulse to get there. She needed to be escaping something or running away or just looking for something new. And I know that mental health, depression, anxiety are issues for college students, very much so. So I thought in this kind of realist world, it would make sense if her mental health problems drove her to look for something new at Michigan. So that was always really important to her from the very start of her plot.
Were you wary at all about like how you would portray mental health? Like, was that something that you were cautious about in writing, or like, did you feel any kind of hesitance around that?
Well, I think I am always conscious about treating difficult and hard and dark topics with sensitivity, just because these issues affect so many people in such different ways. And at the same time, I am always keen in my writing to present them as they really are. In my own reading, I really appreciate work that looks at difficult things head on and doesn't necessarily sort of gloss them or give metaphors or sort of certain linguistic choices to hide the dark things that are going on. I like fiction that addresses them explicitly. So that's what I try to emulate, but it also results in a dark narrative, and I think that that's for specific readers who are looking for that kind of thing.
The mention of what you like as a reader kind of brings me to a question. Like, had you read many college novels?
I had read a few of the sort of classic campus novels from the 20th century. This is like Brideshead Revisited and things like that. And then Martin Amis and Kingsley Amis did the campus thing. And then I think I read The Secret History after I wrote the book. So I wasn't super into the campus novel, the college novel, actually. Uh, as I mean, I'd read some of it for my studies because I study literature, so I was familiar with the tradition, and I did borrow from that tradition and want to reflect it in a lot of ways. But I also didn't really think that there was much out there about sororities and fraternities, so that's what I was trying to do differently.
Right. Yeah. I was curious, kind of like who you are as a reader and what that makes of you as a writer.
Yeah. Yeah, I am really attracted to voice. I think that's above all else what I gravitate towards in my own reading. I really, really love authors who, like, if you pick up a book, you don't have to see who wrote it in order to know who wrote it. So people like Toni Morrison, Von Enkelt, Martin Amis, and then more contemporary like Atez and Moshfegh. These people come to mind. And that's very important in my own writing too, because obviously I love it as a reader. So I try to emulate it myself. I just love voice driven fiction where you can really hear the people in your head.
Do you read aloud then to get voice, like to determine whether you're hitting that
I
aspiration of
mean,
like voice?
I I suppose sometimes I do, especially when I'm editing. I'll read a little bit, especially dialogue. I think is really helpful to hear. It sounds really different when you speak it, than when you just sort of write it out or say it in your head. So sometimes, especially in revisions, when I'm really trying to get tone, dialogue, voice down, I think it can really help to read aloud, even if it's just quietly to yourself. Like, I don't like put on like performances, but I do think it's helpful to getting voice down because voice is really difficult, and hearing it is important.
Yeah, I have to imagine, like you said, when you're talking about like uh, how you portray mental health, that like in the same way that you don't dance around kind of descriptions,
Mm.
trying to get voice, like having you as an authorial voice say something for a character versus like would they actually say this is probably important.
Yeah, I am really interested, like in my own reading, about the difference between the narrator, the characters themselves, and who is saying what, and how that changes the story. And that comes up in the book when you realize by the end that certain stories have been told and manipulated by certain people, because they want to hide things or withhold information. So that's why I kind of have Stella, Penny, and I have the omniscient narrator who is a different character or figure altogether, who's obviously different. All of them are different from the author, because I'm interested in sort of that part of literary theory for my own work. So that's something that I'm often thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. So you mentioned that you wrote the trip thing first, and that
Mm.
is presented in a different perspective than the Penny and Stella sections, and it's sigma, the Greek letter for summation.
Sigma Rho, yeah, Sigma Rho. I think it's the church, and then it's Sigma Rho.
Oh, I'm meaning like instead of like crediting that section,
Yeah,
there's the
yeah,
Greek symbol sigma, which means
yes,
summation.
yeah.
So
So
that's
I
kind of
use.
that
Mhm.
omniscient.
Yeah, exactly. And that was actually, my editor, my really brilliant editor. That was their idea, which I just thought was such a good idea. It originally was just there was no I don't think that there was really anything there, no titles, just not Stella or Penny to signal that this is neither of them. And my editor suggested the Greek letter sigma, to show kind of the omniscience and to show that this voice is now looking at broadly the world and looking at things that the other two girls, the other two narrators can't necessarily see. So yeah, I thought that was a really brilliant idea.
Were you cautious at all about how much you would use that omniscience? That like deploying it to tell the story or summarize could be, taking us away from Penny and Stella.
Yeah, and I also think the omniscient voice is, I think, as a writer, the easiest. Um, because you see everything, you see everyone, you are basically the master manipulator. So it's not so much about withholding information, it's just telling the story however you really like. It gets more difficult when you are speaking from different people's perspectives because everybody knows different things, especially in a book like this where they all come together in unexpected ways. So I was conscious of not relying on the omniscient voice for simplicity. And so it took me a little while to configure the plot to speak mostly from Stella and Penny's perspective, without deferring to the omniscient in order to get things right. So that was a bit of a challenge, actually. And I still prefer writing in first person. I think it's slightly more evocative, but the omniscient third is definitely easier, at least to me as a writer.
So the first person, obviously, one of the things, like, I mean, there's this trope of like an unreliable narrator, but what I found interesting in the way you deploy it is that essentially Stella and Penny are kind of unreliable to themselves and not just the reader.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what I was going for. I think that I don't think either of the girls are deliberately lying or deliberately trying to manipulate the reader or even one another necessarily. I think that they have their reasons for keeping certain information back and for revealing certain information as well. And they think as they're doing this that they're usually acting in their own best interest. I don't know that they're doing it for malicious reasons necessarily. I think they both want really just to be happy. That's what they're going for here. But in their misunderstandings of each other and what's really going on, that leads to problems between them, which they don't necessarily predict.
Yeah. So motivation wise, it seems like Stella wants to be like an idealized version of herself, and Penny wants to be someone else entirely. At
Mhm.
least that's my read on it. Like, did you think deliberately about the contrast in terms of like motivation and like who they were and what they wanted?
Yeah, they I borrowed very much from the German doppelganger tradition, which I've always loved in literature. I think it's just really fascinating, and there's so much that you can do with it. And so they're doppelgangers of one another insofar as they actually reflect one another very much. There's moments where one of them will think something that the other one has thought before, or they use very similar terminology, or they have very similar quirks or habits. Neither of them really realizes this, and I think both of them want to separate themselves from the other. Although Penny does get a bit obsessed with Stella. The idea, I think, is that I wanted them to seem to the reader more similar than they think. The idea being that it's circumstance and chance and all of these kind of little collisions that happen in the Greek life system, which lead them down these different paths, but that really in a different world, they're actually quite similar and they could probably have been really good friends.
There's one thing I kind of picked up on that Stella notes that the boys in the Greek life seem to want to unzip the sorority girls,
Yeah.
and Penny at some point is talking about her friend Leah and wants to not just kiss her but unzip her too and kind of inhabit
Yeah.
her. And I'm curious about kind of is that part of that doppelganger thing that you were looking at both of them
Exactly. Yeah.
considering this
So
unzipping?
yeah, so I was really conscious, and it's just so nice to hear you pick up on that because I was so conscious of giving them kind of weird idiosyncratic phrases that they both use that you might not expect anyone to use. So as to alert the reader that they're both doing it. That's exactly what I meant. There was a moment right when they met where Stella is sort of disgusted by Penny. She just immediately takes dislike to her, and she says, it's such a sign of weakness that she's biting her nails. And then Stella immediately feels an instinct to bite her own nails. So it's things like that where Stella sees perhaps the worst parts of herself or the parts that she doesn't want to encounter head on in Penny and vice versa. Yeah, so I played a lot with them kind of being mirrors of one another.
Right. So is that something where, as you were writing it, like were you writing individual segments thinking, how will this be reflected? Or did you in the editing see like, oh, here I can place reflections and kind of reverse engineer this?
The idea of them as doppelgangers came later. I had the idea of both of them and I had some chapters from both of their perspectives, but uh, the idea of them being uh, connected to one another in a kind of literary sense, in a material sense in the book, came later, which meant that I could edit that in, which was actually really fun because I found these ways to tie them together. Like you mentioned, they would use certain phrases that were very particular, or they would have thoughts that sometimes echoed one another. And I tried to make it so that as time went on, this increased and they just became increasingly embroiled in one another and their similarities kind of blended.
I want to ask you about the adults in the book, and not just the young adults of the central thing, but like the parents come for a parents' weekend. Tripp's father kind of comes but doesn't arrive.
Yeah.
How deliberate were you in terms of like keeping them on the periphery, but then when you show them kind of like that they're not necessarily behaving any better than their children?
Yeah, that's really exactly what I was going for. I didn't want parents to necessarily intrude on the daily goings-ons within this system, because I don't think that that's real. I think on American campuses, very much so, students are just kind of left to their own devices and they go semesters without, besides perhaps their professors, having much of like an adult perspective or presence at all. And I think that that's the case for a lot of undergraduates. And when they do come to campus, I did want to play with the idea of them basically either in some ways going back to their pasts, which they kind of remember fondly, and so they become like the fraternity and the sorority people themselves, and then also with the idea of their children one day becoming them. And so everybody's sort of caught up in this cycle where they are entrapped in the fraternity and the sorority, and even though there's ostensibly sort of adults around, they're not acting like adults at all.
And the other thing that happens on this cast, obviously, Stella goes and sees her therapist as like kind of the other adult in the room, but like there's not a lot of like class in this book. Like there's the library and other hubs within the campus life, but like was that deliberate to kind of stay out of classrooms?
Yeah, I wanted the kind of the chapter organization and the settings to really reflect what they were doing every day, and more so to reflect their mindsets. So in my mind, these two girls aren't thinking about class. They're not worried about it necessarily. It's not what they're focused on. They probably go. I think there's some details. Stella still manages to be a good student, but the book is preoccupied with the things that they themselves are preoccupied with. So I wanted the narrative to kind of reflect just how obsessed they were with the fraternity and the sorority. And in turn, yeah, they're not going to class. They're not really studying, except for when it helps them. Like Stella will go to the library with a boy, for example. But other than that, they're not academic.
Right. The one thing, well, one of the things they're obsessed with is drugs, and whether pharmaceutically prescribed or otherwise. And I'm curious about kind of like how much of that did you have liberty with, or did you like kind of like investigate what kind of drugs would be
Yeah.
real?
I actually took quite a bit of creative license with the drugs. I kind of knew of the sort of classic drugs that are prescribed and that you hear about. And so I had some names that I started with and knew their effects, like looked up their effects and side effects and what happens if you stop taking them cold turkey. And so I looked things like that up. But as the book goes on, I also wanted the drugs to kind of lean into absurdity a bit. So they start off and they're taking things like Prozac, which everyone knows, and then kind of like halfway through the novel, I start making up the names of the drugs, so they're not real. And I wanted that to kind of reflect how much they don't really know what's going on either. They start off having a bit of an understanding of what they're doing, and then it could be anything. They're just doing it to do it, and they don't entirely even know what it is exactly that they're doing.
And in Stella's case, she's, basically like reading the DSM to come up with what symptoms she would need to be prescribed certain medicines by her therapist.
Exactly. Yeah. So I really wanted the scene where she looks the DSM up in the library. So it had to be kind of before. I guess the whole thing had to be before phones because a lot of their issues could have been solved with a phone. But yeah, I wanted that idea of her using that text to manipulate her psychiatrist, who is another example of an adult who kind of acts in a way that contributes to these girls' problems.
Yeah, she means well, but it seems like she's kind of living vicariously through Stella in some way.
Yeah, and Stella is a manipulator, and she acknowledges that she's good at it, and she does it a lot throughout the book. So she treats this as kind of another like game that she can play, and she says the right things. And I think there are a lot of absurdities in psychiatric care. It's very hyperbolized and very extreme, but uh, I think she's trying to use psychiatry like she's trying to use everything else to her benefit. And her psychiatrist is not super like aware of her ability to do that.
You mentioned, the phones would solve this. Like, were you conscious of that? Like that I need to make this in a way, set it in a time where this can't be kind of blown away by
Yeah.
technology?
Yeah, a lot of my reading, again, I a lot of my writing is based on my reading. So a lot of my reading, I study Victorian literature, so obviously those plots are dependent not only on not having phones, but also like letters and, snail mail and things like that. But when I think of a plot, I never think about phones or how technology might impact it, because I think you could just do so many more interesting things if you like can't look on your "Where's My Friends" and see where people are, something like that. So I needed a bit of mystery around that, where people are, what they really mean, because that's where the issues come in the plot. So I think in my mind it's set maybe like 2000, before people really have phones, but they're still listening to like pop music, they're still at frat parties, uh, just to enable them. That's how they get all these misunderstandings. They make all these assumptions for themselves, because they don't have all the information that they need.
And people can kind of disappear for a while.
Exactly. And that makes the other characters wonder where they are and come up with the worst possible conclusions, and they can have coincidental interactions with one another that might not be possible with a phone, and certainly not with social media. One of the main kind of plot points is that Penny meets Trip, and she doesn't realize that it's Trip. But with social media, I don't know that that would really be possible. So I do avoid that sort of thing.
No, for sure. It would create more problems than it solves for you as a writer, I have to imagine. There's like a dark humor to this story. How important was tone?
I think humor is really important especially in books that deal with dark material. I so respect when an author can write about dark things, but also sometimes add some humor to it because it's so dark. And that's one of the things that I really admire in my own reading. So when you do have this darkness and these kind of really chaotic things going on in Greek life, I think there's a lot of opportunity for humor. But of course, it's important, I think, to be aware not to belittle these issues too. There's a fine line between creating humor from it and actually laughing at these problems, which is not what I wanted to do. I wanted to just more so, I guess it's more so irony than humor. It's not like laughing out loud at the gags. It's irony at these situations that arise, less than it is actually directly laughing at them.
Yeah, it's more likely to elicit, a lip curling upwards than
Yeah,
a guffaw.
exactly. Yeah.
The book is out now through Three Rooms Press. How much reaction have you gotten to it from folks so far?
It's been really great. It's been really, really wonderful to kind of see it out in the world. I've had a lot of reactions on social media. I'm quite active in like Bookstagram and Book Talk. So I've had a lot of people who read the arc and then who later bought it, who it seemed like it resonated with them. And that's kind of the best thing that you can, I think, hear as an author, when someone writes to you and says that Penny or Stella or both really spoke to them as a reader. So I've had quite a bit of that, and it's been really wonderful to see, because that's really what I wanted, to sort of speak to people, especially women, through these two characters.
Wonderful. Well, like I said, I on the outside looking in, not knowing the Greek system, found it fascinating. It's out now, The Gilded Butterfly Effect. Heather, thanks very much for joining me, and congratulations on the release of the book.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate you having me.